Hi, everybody. My name is Brandon Iddings. I'm a Field Services Program Manager for Conservation Resources, and today we're going to be talking about planning for the edge of field. So first of all, why do we want to plan for the edge of field? We got to have somewhere to start, so that's where we're looking at our water quality. We have to have a baseline to look at our water quality. So where are we losing some of these nitrates? Where are we losing some of these nutrients? So we're going to focus on assessing the performance of your nutrient management. Where are you losing nitrogen on your farm? And based on those areas, we're going to focus and target our edge of field practices. And then after we got an edge of field practice in, we want to evaluate those areas to see how well they're working. So mainly here at Iowa Soybean Association, we're measuring our nitrates and the concentration of those nitrates. So what is concentration? It's the amount of N per unit of water. So we take out these basically a water bottle, little bottles to collect tile water. Then we can take it back to our lab here at Iowa Soybean Association and do some tests on it, see how much nitrate is in that milligrams per liter. So usually we're looking at there's usually higher concentration of nitrates during the spring because that's when your snow's melting. That's when you're getting these kind of bigger rains, washing out some of that nitrates into the water. We're also focused on nitrates concentration because of the drinking water standards, which is 10 milligrams per liter. These areas, once it is over that, then these water treatment plants are regulated to treat the water to reduce that amount. We're also looking at the load and the yield, so that's kind of the total amount of N over time, so pounds per day. And this is the more chronic issue, the cumulative of all these different fields and areas into streams and into ponds and lakes. These are the algae blooms you're seeing. This is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, so that's kind of why we're focused on that. And we want to look at our water quality holistically. So put your results into a larger scale. So how do you compare to your neighbors? How do you compare to other people in your watershed? How to compare to your fields, your other streams, and then focus on the concentration and load in those areas to kind of where do you fit? Are you losing more nitrates? Are you better? Kind of how that all works. So based on that information, we can create these individual reports for you so you can see, well, am I in the very low, medium, high, very high range? Like, where do I need to focus on my farm? So this is your individual results. It's not other people's. It's showing where you should focus your nutrient management, your nitrogen management. Based off that, we can give some recommendations. So if you're low, very low, maybe you should just look into doing some cover crops. You could you can increase your or you can have better nutrient management, nitrogen management just by doing some cover crops. Pretty easy. Or you average. Well, maybe we should look at throwing an edge of field practice on top of that, focusing in. Maybe it's just one tile that's kind of the issue. Let's treat that water. The high, very high, that's when we kind of do the whole. That's when we kind of bring in all these edge of field practices plus cover crops plus nitrogen nutrient management. Bring it all around, and that's where you're kind of starting to lose some money if you're having that much loss from your nutrients. This is just a pretty simple graph that we came up with here. It's kind of shows it's 1,800 sites, and it shows kind of where they fall in the concentration of your tile water. So quite a few in the very low. The majority of folks do fall in that medium category, so that's on the average. Most folks fall into that 10 to 20 milligrams per liter. The high, very high, that's when we start really need to focus on some of the nitrogen management or nutrient management, and that's where we can start looking at some of that. This is a similar graph. This is kind of focused on more the load and where we should look into doing some of these edge of field practices. Again, there's quite a few folks in this medium area, but this is where you're starting to see in the high, very high areas, 26%. That's where those areas are where we're starting to lose some dollars, and we should do an edge of field practice and really start figuring out where the problem is and fixing that problem to get more into this medium range. So yeah, this kind of just a quick graph that shows the edge of field practice and how effective it is. So the blue circles are the water coming in. Overall, higher nitrates in that water as the water coming out. These red triangles, you can see it's across the board. It's lower nitrates leaving the bioreactor. Bioreactors are pretty successful edge of field practice. They usually reduce 10% of the nitrates as they come in that are going out. Um, yeah, and so now that we've kind of looked at water quality and the why we should sample our water and look at water quality, let's look at kind of the edge of field practices and would they work for you. So is your primary goal water quality? Well, then we can look at a wetland, a saturated buffer, bioreactor, an oxbow. Is your goal habitat? Let's look at wetland, saturated buffers, oxbows, or prairie strips. Or is your goal water management? So if your goal is water management, let's look at controlled drainage, drainage water recycling, um, and all of these practices in that decision tree are from the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual. You can find that on our website or just type in that and you will find it on, it'll come right up on a Google search. So first of all, let's talk about water management. So controlled drainage manages the drainage outlet. So most farm fields in Iowa across the Midwest do have tile running through them. Otherwise, our ground is kind of it'd be too wet. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the yields. We wouldn't have the profitability, productivity that we do. So we do have a lot of tile lines, but makes us as productive as we can be. So the tile line, it lowers the level of the water table out in your fields. So controlled drainage, it puts a control structure in there. So now you're able to control the water table. You can put more stop logs in there, which are these. You can put more stop logs in there, raise your water table in drought times, so your crops can get more water. And then in wet times, you can take these stop logs out and your tile will flow exactly how it did before the control structure. So again, this is just kind of a quick graphic that shows the water in the control structures. As you put your stop logs in, backs up the water, you got your crops having more, it can take more of that water up, raises the water table. And in most farm fields, they're not just perfectly flat, so you're going to need multiple control structures to graze the water as you gain elevation up the drainage area. Yeah, so controlled drainage, it's effective. It can increase your yield, but you do need to manage that. So in wet areas or in wet times, you do want to go out there and take your stop logs out, let that water just flow as needed. But in those dry times, you do put those stop logs in there. Your crops are going to have more water available to them to use. Now we're kind of getting into the automated control structures. So this will make it easier for farmers or tenants who are working at their fields. They don't have to go out manually and adjust those control structures. This is hopefully going to automate it. It's pretty cool, and it will adjust the stop logs as needed based on the water level. Yeah, so controlled drainage, it usually reduces the flow of your water by 30%, and that 33, and then of that 30%, or of the water that is reduced, 33% of that nitrates are treated. So you're getting about as much flow reduction as you do nitrate reduction. So pretty successful practice. This is just a quick map that shows kind of the area that controlled drainage is suitable. So basically most of the Midwest, especially along the Mississippi River corridor, Northwest, North Central Iowa, pretty tons of opportunities. And I mean, across the state, all that red is opportunities. Next, we're going to talk about drainage water recycling. So drainage water recycling, you need a settlement basin. So you need your area where your water is going to be stored. And then from that water stored, you're going to have pumps that will allow you to supplemental irrigate your ground, your crop, to hopefully get some yield benefits and some nitrate treatment. So this is a Central Iowa study site. You got your control site up here to the north and your irrigated site here down here to the south. That is irrigated. That's just a quick graph that shows the control versus the irrigated and the yield increase. on average, your irrigated ground is going to have a yield increase. As you can see here in 2017, there was a huge yield increase. That year we had a wet spring and a dry summer. So when the crops really needed that moisture, it wasn't there. So in the irrigated times, they were able to get water to those crops to have a boost. In 2018, you can see the irrigated ground had less yield because there was actually no irrigation done. We had plenty of rain that year, so they didn't end up irrigating anything. So it's just kind of a wash there. And then in 2020, as you can see, we had the derecho that came through. So the, the the irrigation lines got knocked over, and they weren't able to irrigate at all. This again just shows the average yield difference. It was 35 bushels an acre, but that 2017, if we're going to put these in, they're fairly costly to put these practices in, get the irrigation lines installed, build your pond that you're going to use for your drainage water recycling. So how can we make those effective? Well, 2017, it's going to be those years are really going to be what makes these practices cost effective. If we get enough of those years, these practices are going to pay for themselves fairly quickly. On average, you're not seeing quite that much, but if we keep getting dry like these last couple of years are, you are going to see some of those benefits. Another impact on yield is the variability. So as you can see, the irrigated area, there's a lot less variability. It's a lot more, you're seeing a lot more green, you're seeing a lot more lighter green instead of the reds and all over the boards over here on the right side. You're seeing a lot more consistency to the field instead of just all over the place. This is again just a quick area or a quick map showing these are areas that drainage water recycling could be done at. Not saying areas that don't have the yellow dots wouldn't be good sites. These are just kind of the areas they've mapped so far showing viable drainage water recycling sites. Then moving in towards more of the water quality side of the decision tree, we're going to talk about saturated buffers. So saturated buffers are basically, you got your tile line coming out of your field here. It is going to throw in a control structure that is going to back up the water or raise the water table behind it and also divert the water to these parallel lines to the stream. These lines are perforated, just like most tile lines are. But the cool thing about these is it's going to send it through the buffer strip. Over time, that water is going to percolate out of those lines and be taken up by the roots and the organic matter in the soil, turned into nitrogen gas, the denitrification process, and then that water is cleaner now. Less nitrates in the water. So these are a pretty successful practice. Usually on average, it's 46% of nitrates that flow through a saturated buffer are treated. So that's above our nutrient reduction strategy goals. So good practice to do. This is again just showing you got your control structure here. This is kind of what it looks like out in the field, out of the ground. You got your automated structure up here. That's allowing the farmer to kind of set the limits of what water he's wanting, and it will raise and lower the stop logs as needed. Bioreactors, another edge of field practice. They are 100 foot by 20 foot trenches filled with wood chips. The wood chips they have bacteria in them that takes up the nitrates, turns it into nitrogen gas. It's again that denitrification process. Pretty successful practice. You can see the tile coming out of here. You got your control structure. It is diverting the flow to the bioreactor. In high flows, as you can see here, it's bypassing the bioreactor, but in the majority of time, the water is going into the bioreactor, treating the nitrates, turning it into nitrogen gas, coming back down here, flowing back into your main tile line and into the creek. So it's, again, treating water. It's usually 40% of the average nitrate load is treated. So again, pretty successful practice. The last kind of part of the decision tree is the habitat side of things. So we're going to talk about 3-4 different kinds of habitat edge of field practices that we can do. We have oxbow restorations, wetlands, pollinator plantings, and we're also going to talk about prairie strips. So what is an oxbow? We'll just kind of discuss that real quick first. An oxbow is a old stream meander that gets disconnected over time. It can happen naturally or man-made. So this is kind of a natural oxbow restoration forming. As you can see over time, the center section is being erosion is happening, so it is becoming smaller and smaller over time. Eventually, it does cut through and creates this off-channel wetland, the Oxbow, and then eventually it is completely cut off from the main flow. There's actually clay plugs in here that have been created naturally that aren't allowing the water to flow through there anymore. These areas are really good about almost act as nurseries for fish, good for water quality, have a ton of benefits we'll talk about here in a second. But that's kind of the man-made way oxbows are formed. That is kind of the natural way oxbows are formed. Now, the man-made way that they're formed is a lot of these streams in like the 50s, 60s, 70s were straightened over the years. You can see here in the 1930s, you got this stream that's all meandered, flowing back and forth all over. And then here in the 2018, you have a straightened stream. Man-made way. It happens all across Iowa. So if we can get in here and restore these oxbows, that's a pretty successful edge of field practice, as you'll see. So oxbow restoration benefits: it's increased water wildlife habitat. So you got all kinds of fish species. Usually in these oxbows, we see thousands of fish species. Basically anything that's in your streams, you'll see in these oxbows. We've seen northern pike, crappie, Topeka shiner, all different kinds of minnows. We also see deer. As you can see in this picture, there's deer around there. We see pheasants, quail, all kinds of different species. They're usually in non-productive acres. So as you can see, it wasn't farmed in the 1930s, and in 2018, it still wasn't farmed. So these areas aren't productive. So let's try and get some habitat benefits. Let's try and get some water quality benefits. These oxbows are pretty successful. They usually treat anywhere from 40 to 50% of the nitrates that go into them. These areas are also good with flood mitigation. So as you can see, a 1 acre oxbow roughly holds 1 million gallons of water. So in some areas that flood consistently, if you have 50, 100 oxbows along the landscape, that's going to hold a lot of flood water. They're also good for the soil that comes out of them. Usually these oxbows are 4 to 6 foot deep. We take that good black dirt. It's usually the top 3 to 4 feet of the oxbow. It's really good black dirt. Let's put it out in that farm field where it came from. Let's put it on a sandy knob, a bald knob, and maybe try and get some yield benefits from it. It can also act as a really good off-channel water source for cattle or other livestock. We make the slopes very gentle so the cows can get right in and out. A lot of people are worried about their cows getting stuck in them, but with the gentle slopes and on the bottom, it's actually the old stream bed, so it's usually either sandy or gravel layer there as well. So usually we don't have to worry about cows getting stuck. The next thing we're going to talk about is a wetland. So what is a wetland? A wetland is just kind of it's kind of like a natural prairie pothole. We used to have wetlands all across the state of Iowa. Over time, we farmed them, lost some of these areas. So a wetland is just kind of a shallow body of water that is treating some of these nitrates. It can be along a stream. It can be just out in the middle of a field where you got tile water coming into it, but just an area that is ponded that is going to be treating some of these. So why would we want wetlands? They're very good habitat, great water quality, help with erosion. So let's talk about some of these benefits. So habitat, you can have hundreds, thousands of geese, ducks, just all different kinds of waterfowl on these. Using these, we're in flyover areas in Iowa, so they utilize these fairly heavily. There's also upland bird species that use these, deer. It also, another benefit is reduced drain flow. So it is kind of slowing that water as the water is coming in off the tile or from a stream. It slows that water down. So that helps with erosion and sediment control. With the slower water, it gives time for that sediment to settle over time. And that there's also the water quality benefits. The plants along the edge or in the water and the organic matter in the soil actually use that nitrates in the water, turn it into nitrogen gas. Like I've said previously, it's that denitrification. And before I move on, I guess, wetlands usually treat anywhere from 50%, maybe even a little higher on average of the water that comes, of the nitrates that come into them is treated. So Moving on, we got pollinator plantings. Why would we want pollinator plantings? Well, pollinator plantings have a ton of benefits, like I've said, of these other practices: erosion, water quality, habitat. You kind of have all these. It just kind of what do you want for your farm? There's a ton of benefits we can pair with pollinator plantings. So usually we focus on these unproductive areas. So are you putting more inputs than you're getting yield out? Let's put a pollinator planting there because there are these benefits. Or do you want a buffer strip along your stream? Are you worried about erosion happening? Let's put these native prairie pollinator plants along that buffer to help with some of that erosion. It's very good for water quality, like I said, on all of these. There's a lot of organic matter in the soil. The plants themselves take up some of those nitrates in the water. And then the obvious one, it's the wildlife habitat and the wildlife value. So you got all kinds of bird species, you got deer, the pollinator species for other bees, butterflies, that kind of thing. The last thing we're going to talk about is prairie strips. So prairie strips, I like to tell people, they're kind of act as a more natural terrace. So it's basically a terrace, but you're using living plants to be your erosion control, your grade stabilization a little bit. So again, you're kind of more planting these in your unproductive areas, your kind of drainage ditches, or your areas that have had erosion coming out of your field. Let's plant it in there to hopefully stabilize that area. It's usually a cost effective because you're planting seeds and having them do the work instead of doing dirt work and pushing up a bunch of dirt to create your terrace. Good with water quality. The plants take up that nitrogen, and then, like I said, erosion control. They're pretty successful. So this is just kind of a cool graph that I like to show people at the end here. Talks about wetlands, saturated buffers, bioreactors, controlled drainage, shallow drainage, showing how successful those at load reduction of nitrogen. You got your wetland saturated buffers. Oxbows usually tend to be paired right up in that same area, and bioreactors all right around 40 to 50% of our nutrient or nitrogen reduction. So that's right at our the nutrient reduction strategy's goal of 45%. Some of these areas that we would plant pollinators or prairie strips, it would fall more into the CRP, perennial energy crop area. So then you're getting a ton of nitrogen load reduction, and then you also have your controlled drainage and shallow drainage. Those would be, they're again not capturing all of the nitrogen that is flowing through, but they're capturing a lot, and we're going to need all of these practices to be effective at getting to our nutrient reduction strategy goal. And with that, I appreciate everybody watching, and if you want to hear more or learn more about soybeans or edge of field practices, go to iasoybeans.com. Thank you.